Tlaloc, the Aztec god of rain, and Huitzilopochtli, the Aztec god of war, together being the two gods honored at the Great Pyramid of the Aztec capital, Tenochtitlan. By looking into her class, design, skill set, backstory, and characterization, how well does Tenochtitlan compare to her historical and mythical counterpart? And what grade would I give her depiction? Let's do this. Tenochtitlan is a Pretender class servant, only the second one I have covered since my video on Oberon. Wow, that was a while ago. So what's going on here? Well, I gave a pretty strong hint in the opening, but to expand upon that, Tenochtitlan is a city, but she is pretending to be the gods Tlaloc and Huitzilopochtli, the two gods that had their shrines atop the Great Pyramid of Tenochtitlan, also known as the Templo Mayor. As you can guess from them having such a prominent place atop the biggest pyramid in the capital of the Aztec Empire, these two gods were quite a big deal for them. Tlaloc was the god of rain, while Huitzilopochtli was both a war and sun god. Both the rain and the sun are rather important for agriculture, while war is how the Aztecs would get sacrifices, something I'll talk about more later. Now, before we find out that Tenochtitlan is a pretender, we fight her a few times in Lost Belt 7, and she takes on two different classes depending upon which of those two deities she is emphasizing in the battle. When acting as Tlaloc, she is a ruler class servant. That makes sense to me. I've already talked about why I tend to think divinities usually should get the ruler class, since acting as an impartial overseer is kinda what they're supposed to do already. But there are exceptions to that rule, and one of them applies when Tenochtitlan acts as Huitzilopochtli, becoming a berserker class servant. Not only does that make sense for a war god, I'd go as far to say that Huitzilopochtli is a potential candidate for Grand Berserker. I mean, we can't summon him independently yet, and divinities normally can't be Grand Servants, but that didn't stop Tezcatlipoca, now did it? As for Tenochtitlan itself, well, for the first, and certainly not the last time in this video, Tenochtitlan is a city. There's no class here that makes sense. But between Tlaloc being a ruler, Huitzilopochtli being a berserker, and Tenochtitlan being a pretender due to how she pretends to act as both of these deities, but is in fact neither of them, but actually the city where these two gods were worshipped, I think all of that is quite good. Getting into her character design, we first have to talk about gender because, well, it's a bit complicated. On the one hand, both Tlaloc and Huitzilopochtli were male gods. Tlaloc specifically had two female gods as consorts, Xochiquetzal and Chalchihuitliqui, whereas Huitzilopochtli seems to have stayed single. But on the other hand, Tenochtitlan is only pretending to be Tlaloc and Huitzilopochtli. She isn't meant to be either of them. Instead, she is an elemental from Lake Texcoco who became the heart of the city, Tenochtitlan. And a city doesn't really have a gender. Much like Kukulkan, the servant Tenochtitlan is effectively an original character the FGO writers have created, even if they named it after a real place. So, it would have been a gender flip if our servant actually was Tlaloc or Huitzilopochtli, but since it's a spirit embodying a city, I guess it's not a gender flip, because there's no gender to flip in the first place. As for her ascension forms, I should first note that, in-game, when you swap between the various ascension forms, it also changes the character's name. Her first ascension is called Tlaloc, her second is called Huitzilopochtli, while the third is Tenochtitlan. But when she swaps between Tlaloc and Huitzilopochtli in Lost Belt 7, she doesn't change ascension forms. Instead, her aura changes and her eyes glow red. So it's less that her second ascension is meant to be Huitzilopochtli, but rather that it's a change of clothes. They just decided to give the two different names for those first two ascension forms, before moving on to her true name and form in her third and final ascensions. Her first ascension certainly looks Mesoamerican, and while it may not look quite like the usual depictions of Tlaloc or Huitzilopochtli, it still has connections to both of them. First, there's her whip, something that is used in rituals for the god Tlaloc, as well as being the weapon that Huitzilopochtli uses. Xiuhcoatl, the turquoise serpent, is sometimes thought of as being like a whip. There are also the blood-soaked hands, likely a reference to the insane amount of human sacrifice done in the name of these two gods. Also the feathers, though I'll talk more about that later. For her second ascension, Tenochtitlan straight up says that she is just copying her brother, Tezcatlipoca, going with a more modern look just like he does in his first ascension. I should note that it is Huitzilopochtli that is Tezcatlipoca's brother, not Tlaloc, nor the city of Tenochtitlan. As for her third and final ascensions, it veers away from the Mesoamerican look, but still keeps elements from her first ascension, like the feathers, the front skirt thing, and more. Overall, I'd say that Tenochtitlan's design is alright. The first ascension is definitely the best from an accuracy perspective, but her design is obviously a work of creative license more than anything else. Moving into her skill set, Tenochtitlan's first skill is Third Sun, which is an obvious reference to Tlaloc, who was the god of the third sun in the Aztec creation myth. I talked about this before in my video on Quetzalcoatl and Kukulkan, but when acting as the third sun, Tezcatlipoca captured Tlaloc's consort, the goddess Xochiquetzal. This made Tlaloc depressed, leading him to neglect his duties as both the third sun and as a rain god. After a while, with the people of the third sun suffering due to the lack of rain, Tlaloc eventually did make it rain. He made it rain fire, turning the world of the third sun to ashes. Tenochtitlan's second skill is Xochiyeyotl, which roughly translates to Flower War. What's that? Is it a war where people got together to fight over who had the prettiest flowers? No, not quite. It's actually a term for a specific type of ritualized warfare that the Aztec Empire undertook. The Aztecs would meet with one of their rivals, and then schedule a place and time for the fight, with both sides bringing equal numbers of warriors. When the day arrived, they would use melee weapons rather than more deadly ranged weapons, and the goal was to wound or capture enemies rather than kill them. These flower wars were seen as a way for the Aztecs to show off their skill in battle, capture enemies for sacrifice, and weaken potential rivals, since because both sides had to bring equal numbers of warriors, that favored the Aztecs due to their much larger population. However, even if these flower wars did not end in conquest or mass destruction like more normal wars, they still fueled hatred of the Aztecs in many of the city-states that the Aztecs waged flower wars against. Hatreds that would motivate many of those city-states to join the Spanish during their conquest of the Aztec Empire. Anyway, as far as this skill goes, it obviously isn't connected to Tlaloc, but rather Huitzilopochtli, the war god. At the same time though, since these flower wars were a major part of the Aztec Empire, it also connects with the capital of that empire, Tenochtitlan. Lastly, Tenochtitlan's third skill is Lake of the Moon, or Metztilapan, Lake Texcoco. Lake Texcoco is, or was, a lake in central Mexico that, for much of ancient Mesoamerica's history, was actually left alone, because it was a very salty lake surrounded by marshes, not exactly the best place to build a settlement. However, after many years since being driven out of Aztlan and looking for a new homeland, it would be here that the Mexica people, better known as the Aztecs, would build their new home, the city of Tenochtitlan. I'll be telling the full story in the backstory section, but suffice to say, this is a superb skill not just for Tenochtitlan, but arguably for Huitzilopochtli as well, since he plays a central role in the Aztecs choosing this location for their new home.
心臓都市起動我がアルタール我がカットーラ我が愛しきトラバカスキ今度こそ私は失わない
Tenochtitlan's noble phantasm is Ometeotl Tenochtitlan, whereupon she floats up into the air, gets into a giant robot, and then fires a massive beam of energy at her enemies. Ometeotl, literally meaning two god, refers to the two creator gods in Aztec mythology, Ometecutli and Omecihuatl. I talked about them in the video on Tezcatlipoca, that they are the twin gods that created the four Tezcatlipocas, who then went on to create the world. Quick reminder, the four Tezcatlipocas are Tezcatlipoca, Quetzalcoatl, Xipetotec, and Huitzilopochtli. On the surface, this MP doesn't connect to the Ometeotl, unless you take its literal meaning of two god, because remember how our servant here pretends to be the gods Tlaloc and Huitzilopochtli, and how these gods were, together, the two gods worshipped at the Great Pyramid in Tenochtitlan? If you look at it like that, then the Ometeotl in the MP name may not mean the two creator gods who made the four Tezcatlipocas, but rather the literal meaning two god, meaning Tlaloc and Huitzilopochtli. As for the MP itself, Tenochtitlan jumps into this giant robot, and, well, there's a few neat Easter eggs here. First, you may notice that the shoulder cone things are different colors. The left is blue, while the right is red. Or rather, the north side is blue, while the south side is red, when the robot faces west while firing that beam. This is a direct reference to the Templo Mayor, since the temple did face west. The northern shrine was blue, dedicated to Tlaloc, while the southern shrine was red, dedicated to Huitzilopochtli. And, of course, the red beam shoots down a long flight of stairs that closely resemble those that would have been found on the Great Temple. This MP is basically recreating the temple in the form of a giant robot, and then using the power accumulated by all the sacrifices done at the Templo Mayor, and using that to power this giant laser beam. In other words, this MP is absolutely loaded with symbolism connecting to Tlaloc, Huitzilopochtli, but above all the Great Temple of Tenochtitlan. Honestly, as far as figuring out an MP for the city of Tenochtitlan goes, I don't think the designers could have done better. This is absolutely fantastic. Tenochtitlan's craft essence is Aztlan My Home, depicting a house, but in the hand of the giant robot from her NP. Based on the CE's text, she is actually offering us this house as a place to live, also that she's moving in with you. As for the CE's name, it is referring to Aztlan, the mythical homeland of the Aztec people, which I mentioned earlier. We don't know exactly where Aztlan is supposed to have been, only that it was to the north. So either somewhere in what is today northern Mexico, or perhaps the southern United States. The Mexica people would then head south into central Mexico, trying to find somewhere to call home, which was hard because, even by Mesoamerican standards, the Aztec approach to religion, and especially human sacrifice, was a bit much. I'll be continuing this in the backstory section. Tenochtitlan's Valentines CE is hummingbirds to open a secret room, depicting two hummingbird-shaped keys. The CE's text tells us that these are a pair of keys to the giant robot depicted in her MP, as does the scene that comes with it. Actually, the Valentine's scene is pretty interesting, since it follows Tenochtitlan trying to understand what Valentine's Day is, and what gift might be best to go with it. Her initial idea is to offer a heart, like what the Aztecs would offer the god Huitzilopochtli, but Tezcatlipoca lets Tenochtitlan know that offering someone a heart isn't really in style anymore, eventually leading her to giving the gift that she does, and offering the protagonist to let them see her innermost self whenever they like. On a related note, you may have noticed that Tezcatlipoca regularly refers to Tenochtitlan as Hummingbird, both in this scene and throughout Lost Belt 7. This is a reference to Huitzilopochtli, who is strongly associated with hummingbirds. His name literally translates to left-handed hummingbird. Also, since Huitzilopochtli is one of the four Tezcatlipocas, this is why Tenochtitlan in turn calls Tezcatlipoca her brother, even if she's not actually Huitzilopochtli. Lastly, Tenochtitlan herself refers to the protagonist in this scene as her Tlamacazqui, her priest, part of the titles of the two leading figures at the Templo Mayor. Anyway, this too is a really good CE. Now for characterization, starting with a look at the legends surrounding Tenochtitlan. So, there are three entities for us to contend with here. The two gods, Tlaloc and Huitzilopochtli, that our servant is pretending to be, and her true identity, a spirit embodying the heart of the city of Tenochtitlan. Conveniently, all three of these different characters are related to each other. I've already mentioned that the largest temple in the city of Tenochtitlan, the Templo Mayor, had two shrines atop it, one dedicated to Tlaloc, and the other to Huitzilopochtli. But because these are three different beings that I have to talk about, I'm going to have to trim things a bit to make sure that this backstory section isn't stupidly long. To that end, I'll give some general details about Tlaloc and Huitzilopochtli, but the real emphasis will be on our servant's true identity, Tenochtitlan. So, starting with Tlaloc, he is the Aztec god of rain, thunder, and lightning. There is ample evidence that Tlaloc is a much older god than that, though, going as far back as Teotihuacan, over 1,000 years before the Aztecs. In the Legend of the Five Sons, Tlaloc is the third son, but as mentioned earlier, he ended up destroying that world after Tezcatlipoca stole Tlaloc's first consort, the goddess Xochiquetzal. His second consort, Chalchihuitliqui, would become the fourth son, but then Tezcatlipoca made her cry by telling her she would never compare to Tlaloc's previous consort, and her tears ended up flooding the world. Since Tlaloc is a god of rain, and rain is kinda important to agriculture, he ended up becoming a very important god, one that needed regular offerings in order to bring the rain. But the sacrificial offerings the Aztecs made to Tlaloc, Well, they involved children. More than that, if the children were crying while being taken to the place they were to be sacrificed, that was considered to be a good sign, whereas the opposite was the case if they were not crying. I may have gone into that bit in the Tez video about me having a serious problem with cultural destruction, but I'm also glad that this ritual doesn't happen anymore. As far as I'm concerned, cultural relativism has its limits. You can have your customs and your faith, but I draw the line when those customs or faith start hurting or oppressing others. Anyway, enough of that. In contrast to Tlaloc, Huitzilopochtli is a god specific to the Aztecs, being the patron god of the Mexica people, as well as being both their god of war and their god of the sun. It probably shouldn't surprise you that, for a people as warlike as the Aztecs, this guy was a pretty big deal. There are several stories concerning Huitzilopochtli's origins, with one in particular highlighting his importance to the Aztecs. In this story, Huitzilopochtli's mother is the goddess Coatlicue, who was then impregnated by a ball of feathers. Her other children, the goddess Coyolxauhqui and her 400 brothers, were upset by this, and so decided to kill their mother. But then Huitzilopochtli burst forth from his mother, fully grown and fully armed, beheading his sister Coyolxauhqui before going after his brothers, who all scattered away from him, becoming the stars in the night sky. His sister's severed head, in turn, would become the moon. It was then believed that Huitzilopochtli, being the god of the sun, was engaged in a constant struggle against his sister and 400 brothers, with this being the explanation of the day and night cycle. But, crucially, it was believed that if Huitzilopochtli were defeated, the sun would go out, and the world would be cast into permanent darkness. To keep that from happening, the Aztecs would offer the hearts of sacrifices to Huitzilopochtli, to give him the strength he needed to continue the fight. This might seem crazy to us today, but the Aztecs took this very seriously. And can you blame them? The sun is kind of important for, life. And even if you thought this story was nonsense and you didn't actually need to sacrifice people regularly in order to keep the sun in the sky, did you really want to stop the sacrifices in order to find out? There is another story involving Huitzilopochtli that is worth telling, because it ties directly into the true identity of our servant. I've mentioned earlier that the Mexica people, the Aztecs, were exiled from their homeland of Aztlan, and that they wandered south into central Mexico in order to find a new homeland. For the longest time, this proved rather difficult. But they had one thing in particular they were looking for, a sign that, if they were able to find it, would let the Mexica know where they would find their new home. It was Huitzilopochtli who had told them what to look for, the sight of an eagle perched upon a cactus eating a snake. The Mexica people continued to wander the land, until they ended up finding that exact sign on an island in the middle of Lake Texcoco, and so it would be there that they would make their new home. This area hadn't been settled before due to what I talked about in our servant's third skill, that it was a marshy, salty lake nobody really wanted. Nevertheless, the god Huitzilopochtli had clearly directed the Aztecs to this place, and so they sought to make it work, founding their city of Tenochtitlan. As for when this happened, the actual date of the city's founding is a bit murky, but the date that was later settled on is the 13th of March, 1325, meaning that, a few weeks ago, this city had its 700th birthday. I really would have wanted to release this video on that day, but that Quetz video took too damn long to make, and then other stuff happened. I did make a community post about it that day, but I still see this as a missed opportunity. Anyway, the Aztecs made the most of their new home, transforming this swampy marsh nobody had wanted before into a gargantuan city. Some estimates say that, at its height, the city of Tenochtitlan had at least 200,000 people, making it the largest city in the Americas. The city of Tenochtitlan, together with its two allied cities of Texcoco and Tlacopan, would form the Triple Alliance, what has become known as the Aztec Empire. That alliance, by the way, is reflected in one of Tenochtitlan's passives, City-State Alliance. This alliance would dominate central Mexico for about a century, building gigantic temples, imposing their will upon their neighbors, and waging flower wars to collect sacrifices. The Aztecs actually kept many of their great rivals alive for this purpose, most notably the Tlaxcala, who deeply resented the Aztecs for regularly attacking them and taking their people to be sacrificed in their city of Tenochtitlan. But then, something would happen that would change everything. In 1519, strange men arrived upon the shores of Mexico, bringing with them things that had never been seen before in Mesoamerica: steel, horses, and gunpowder. Hernán Cortés had arrived. The Spanish came to Mexico with only a tiny handful of troops, but several events ensured that Cortés would be able to conquer the Aztec Empire despite being horribly outnumbered. First, there's the advantage in technology, and the surprise the Aztecs felt from encountering horses and guns for the first time. But that only goes so far, not enough to counter the numerical advantage the Aztecs had. But that problem was then solved by the fact that many enemies of the Aztecs, notably the Tlaxcala, chose to join Cortés, providing him with tens of thousands more allies to help even the odds. This made the Aztecs take the new arrivals much more seriously, inviting them to their capital of Tenochtitlan as guests to see what they were about. The Spanish would take over the city from within, holding the Emperor Moctezuma II hostage, but they were then thrown out with heavy losses for both sides. The Aztec Emperor was killed during the fighting. But while Cortés was regrouping, building up a new army to assault the city for real, the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan fell victim to the Columbian Exchange. Let me define that term for a moment. The Columbian Exchange, named after Christopher Columbus, refers to the massive exchange of goods between the New and Old World, leading to profound changes in both. At its most positive, this came in the form of food. The Americas got things like apples, wheat, rice, and more, while the Europeans, Africans, and Asians got corn, potatoes, tomatoes, chocolate, and more. Other parts of the exchange were less equal. Turkey came to the Old World, but into the New World came horses, pigs, chicken, a vast array of domestic animals. But the most notorious aspect of the Columbian Exchange, and the one most relevant to our story, is disease. Illnesses that had never been seen before in the Americas were brought over, and since the people of the Americas had never encountered these diseases before, and so had no immunity to them, the results were apocalyptic. It is estimated that perhaps as much as 95% of the native population of the Americas would die within the first century of the Europeans' arrival. The Americas did give something back. Syphilis is believed to have been brought to Europe by men who had sailed with Columbus. But while syphilis did kill millions, it didn't destroy Europe in the way smallpox destroyed the Americas. On a related note, since so much of the native population died off, the Spanish and other European powers had to find someone else to work in the mines and plantations, leading directly to the Atlantic slave trade. While the Europeans arriving in the Americas initially didn't know what disease would do to the native population, this nevertheless remains one of the darkest chapters in human history. Anyway, to get back on topic, while Cortés was building up to attack Tenochtitlan, the city was afflicted by a horrible outbreak of disease. So by the time the Spanish and their allies returned to attack Tenochtitlan, the Aztec Empire was fatally weakened, and Tenochtitlan would fall to the invaders in 1521. The city was devastated, hundreds of thousands were dead, and the Spanish would destroy the city's temples. Over the ruins of Tenochtitlan, the Spanish would build a new city to serve as the capital of their new colony, a city we know today as Mexico City. Nevertheless, despite their best efforts, the legacy of Tenochtitlan would not be forgotten. The Templo Mayor may have been destroyed, but excavations uncovered its remains in the late 20th century. And in 1821, after Mexico had won its independence from the Spanish, they looked to the past to help forge their new identity. The legend of Huitzilopochtli guiding the Aztecs to where they would found Tenochtitlan, the sign of an eagle perched atop a cactus eating a serpent, would become the Mexican coat of arms, which also features at the center of their national flag. In other words, while the city of Tenochtitlan and the gods worshipped there may be gone, its legacy is still with us, serving as the foundation for one of the great nations of the modern world. Shifting over to Fate Grand Order, we first meet Tenochtitlan in Lost Belt 7, Rahui Mictlan. Here, she starts out as a villain, working together with Tezcatlipoca and Izcalli in leading the Ocelome in their war against the Denos. She proves to be a particularly dangerous opponent, defeating Nitocris several times, and made all the more ominous by her special powers. When acting as Tlaloc, she fills the battlefields with rain and water, only to shift into a brutally dangerous warrior as Huitzilopochtli. But because she is not actually either of these gods, but is only pretending to be, It takes time for Chaldea to find a suitable countermeasure, since anti-divine weapons turn out not to work very well. It is only once Nitocris Alter enters the fray, wielding the powers of the god Anubis, that Tenochtitlan's true identity is finally unveiled, and so allowing Chaldea to fight and defeat her. Even so, because Tenochtitlan is, a city, this makes her extremely tough on the defense, and she is the type to keep fighting even after taking severe injuries. Throughout Part 1 of Lost Belt 7, we don't really get to know Tenochtitlan aside from being a dangerous menace to struggle against. This starts to change as we get more scenes with her, particularly her reaction to discovering what Tezcatlipoca and Daybit's true plans are, to awaken Ort, and so to destroy the world. And since Tenochtitlan built a recreation of her old city in the 7th Lost Belt, if Tez and Daybit's plan were to succeed, that would mean that her city would meet its end, again. At first, Tenochtitlan tries to suppress those thoughts, continuing to work as an ally to Tezcatlipoca, since he is one of the top gods of the Aztec pantheon, and so is someone she takes seriously. It is only after being defeated by Chaldea that she switches sides, helping them reach Ort to try to stop Tezcatlipoca and Daybit's plan, though that ultimately doesn't work out. Because what truly motivates Tenochtitlan is that she wants to look out for the people who live in her city. She is the guardian of the people who live there, and so looking out for them is what is most important to her. If you look at the history, then this makes sense. Her city is gone, destroyed by invaders. The mighty empire that called her city home might have been able to put up a better fight, but smallpox took such a frightful toll on the population, making them easy prey for the Spanish and their local allies. Tenochtitlan isn't Artoria from Fate's Stay Night. She's not trying to undo the past, or to become a city once again. But since she built that city in Nahui Mictlan, and that its inhabitants do their best to defend it, she too rallies her strength to face off against another invader from parts unknown. It may be painful, and it may be hopeless, but Ort's assault gives Tenochtitlan a chance to protect her people once again. And while she wasn't able to stop the monster, it was at least something she found worth doing, a chance to be a guardian for those who call her city home. Now, when it comes to assessing the accuracy of her characterization, this is obviously a bit difficult, since, as I've said many times throughout this video, Tenochtitlan is a city, not a person. There's no personality to compare to the original. For all intents and purposes, Tenochtitlan is, like Kukulkan and Camazotz, a new original character. Still, there are aspects of Tenochtitlan's personality that make sense for her true identity. She is noted as being a big fan of traditional architecture, having decided to remake Mexico City in Lost Belt 7 without any modern buildings, and she is rather disparaging towards the Stormborder. The powers that she uses, of the two gods of her city, the blood from the Great Temple that powers her MP, as well as being able to take incredible amounts of punishment, those all make sense too. But most of all, it's her connection to the inhabitants of her city, her desire to protect them, that makes sense for the anthropomorphization of a city. Tenochtitlan might be a new character, but she does possess traits that at least make sense based upon the city that she is supposed to represent. And now for the verdict. What grade would I give Tenochtitlan's depiction in Fate Grand Order? Well, her character design is decent enough. Her first ascension is the clear winner from an accuracy perspective. Her skill set is absolutely fantastic, giving links to both the gods she is pretending to be and the city that she actually is. The MP in particular is so loaded with symbolism and links together all three of her identities, it's brilliant. But then, what about characterization? How do I judge the accuracy of a character to an original that isn't a person, or even an animal? I mean, there are cities out there with personality, traits we commonly associate with them, but we're talking about a city that's been dead for 500 years. We know about the religious practices, impressive organization, and how awestruck the Spanish were upon seeing it. But what was it like to live there? The attitudes of its people? We don't know. Still, with the sheer volume of connections Tenochtitlan has to what we know of the original city, her personality that favors traditional architecture, a reverence for Aztec mythology, and a strong desire to protect the people that call her city home, Tenochtitlan's characterization makes sense. It is certainly new for Fate to create a servant out of a location rather than a person from history or myth, but as far as I'm concerned, their first attempt at it is quite a good one. And so for a final grade, I'm going to give Tenochtitlan, the old capital of the Aztec Empire, a B+. If you would like to learn more about another character who does her best to protect others, check out my video on Gareth here. Also, please like, subscribe, and come check out the streams during the weekend sometime. And one more thing, there's a guy named Dolmater here on YouTube who has been making reaction videos to my videos. We don't entirely see eye to eye, but he's pretty knowledgeable and adds some interesting input, often things I have to leave out of videos due to time constraints. Also, I leave comments of my own, a reaction to his reaction, you could say. Anyway, go check that out if you like. I'll put a link in the video description. Until next time.